The Texas House gives preliminary approval to a bill that would change our state's congressional maps, despite Democrats' efforts to stop it. Good evening, and thank you for being with us. KLTV7's Michael Richardson reports tonight on the debate that happened before that vote that went on for more than 7 hours.
The underlying goal of this plan is straightforward: improve Republican political performance.
Republican Representative Todd Hunter making clear the purpose of the bill he filed that would add 5 Republican-leaning districts to Texas's congressional maps. The vote comes over 2 weeks after House Democrats left the state in protest of a mid-decade redraw, and after Governor Greg Abbott added the item to the first special session in light of constitutional concerns raised by the U.S. Department of Justice.
Redistricting can be done at any point in time.
Democratic lawmakers introduced multiple amendments to the bill, including one that would have stopped the new maps from going into effect until the federal government releases material relating to the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein.
This isn't about fairness or representation. It's about rushing through maps before 2026 midterms elections.
Democrats have argued that the maps represent a form of racial gerrymandering, which Republicans deny.
Those who vote in favor of this bill will be supporting a process that has been engineered to dilute the power and voices of voters of color in Texas. With the push of a button, you are taking the decision away from the voters of Texas.
4 out of 5 Hispanic majority out of those new districts, that's a pretty strong message, and it's good.
Michael Richardson, KLTV7 News.
California is one of the states also looking into changing its congressional maps, where lawmakers may follow through on a plan to try to offset Republican gains here in Texas.